Good evening. I'm Maria Altman, one of the editors here at St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome and thanks for joining us for our 2021 virtual Mini J School. It's our fourth session in the series, and we're really excited to be discussing investigative journalism tonight. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri-St. Louis, an institution that transforms lives through education. And we want to thank our members for supporting us. Our more than 26,000 donors, many of you are among them, contributed over $6 million over the last year, allowing us to bring you award-winning local news, podcasts, and events like this. Tonight, of course, we're going to talk about investigative journalism and how it serves as an important watchdog in our society. So how do journalists unearth information and reveal truth? In this session, Jeremy Kohler from ProPublica, Molly Parker of the Southern Illinoisan, Tom Scheck with APM Reports, American Public Media's investigative reporting and radio documentaries project, will discuss this topic, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So I'm going to give a quick intro or bio for each of our guests. Jeremy Kohler is a reporter covering issues in the Midwest. He came to ProPublica from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which many of you know, where he worked for more than 20 years. As an investigative reporter there, he produced projects that exposed fraud and abuse in policing, prisons, pension systems, hospitals, and courts. For the past 3 years, his coverage has focused on St. Louis County government and politics, where he contributed to an investigation into corruption that triggered a federal probe and ended up with the county executive going to prison. In July, Kohler reported a widely read story delving into the litigation history of Mark and Patricia McCloskey, known as the St. Louis gun couple. And I know many of you probably read that story. Molly Parker has been a reporter with the Southern Illinoisan since 2014. She returned to work in her home region after reporting for several years in Central Illinois, South Carolina, Mississippi, and North Carolina. Molly was selected to participate in the ProPublica local reporting network in 2018. In that program, she spent a year investigating HUD's failed oversight of public housing in small towns throughout the Midwest. She was selected again in 2020 for a 3-year fellowship with ProPublica to investigate topics of interest in downstate Illinois. And Tom Scheck is a reporter for APM Reports, American Public Media's investigative reporting and radio documentaries project. As a reporter for Minnesota Public Radio News, he's covered 2 statewide recounts, 2 presidential elections, 2 state government shutdowns, and too many legislative hearings to remember. His work has been on several national shows, including NPR's All Things Considered and Morning Edition and Weekend Edition. So welcome to all of you, and thanks for being here. Let's get down to the main topic of the evening then. And I'm going to start by asking each of you, I guess we'll start with Jeremy. How did you end up in investigative reporting? What drew you to it?
I was thinking about that, and I think it was around 2003. I had been at the Post-Dispatch for about 5 years. My first job at the Post-Dispatch was covering Jefferson County. I ended up on the general assignment desk after that, and then I went to the police beat. And I'd been on the police beat for a couple months in 2003. I don't know if you remember the riots in Portland in like 2002 over the World Ag Forum. It kind of, took the police by surprise. There was some property damage downtown, and it was mostly like, it was like environmentally motivated. Well, St. Louis was hosting a World Ag Forum in 2003. And, there was a lot of police intel that there were going to be anarchists that were going to tear the town up. And there was about a week, and we were writing about all the preparations for, for this forum and all that, that the domestic terrorists were going to be coming to town, the police thought. Anyway, about 2 nights before the forum started, the St. Louis police went in and arrested a bunch of like 20-year-old kids that were squatting in this house. And, and they had like a press conference, and they had like a table with like a bunch of water guns and like buckets of nails. And they were like they were going to shoot urine at us through the water guns, and they were going to throw nails at us. We're like, people were like, well, the house was under construction, so maybe the nails were from the house construction project.
This sounds quaint compared to
yeah,
today.
yeah, exactly. Well, we got the police, we got a tip that this was going to be going down. So when we went out to cover it, the police had all their badges removed, and it was the first time I saw that. And then we covered this press conference, and we asked what the motivation was for these arrests, because the police just went in and arrested all these people preemptively. And the police said it was they were assisting the city building inspectors on a routine building inspection of this home. And to me, it was kind of the eureka moment, like, police lie, the government lies. And so I think from that, everything that fell out after that, I mean, years later, the police department apologized to all these kids, all those kids were like now 30, they're all lawyers themselves. And but that kind of just sparked this interest for me, moving from covering something to uncovering things. And that's always just been kind of my motivation since then. I mean, it wasn't long after that, I was on the city police beat. And if you remember the early 2000s, that like the crime reports were, going down by the year, but it didn't really feel like it was getting that much safer. It was just that the stats were getting better. And I had a source tell me that the police were writing these informal memos when there was a crime that was reported that they didn't really think happened. And so there wouldn't be computerized, it would just go into a file cabinet, and then it would just be thrown away. And they did this especially with sexual assaults, especially with victims that could be easily discredited if they're prostitutes or drug users or something like that. And so there was one year, I think it was like 2000, I think it was 2003 again, where the city of St. Louis reported 71 rapes. And I remember, I live in Belnor. I'm sure you're all familiar with Rick Rosenfeld. He's an UMSL criminologist. He lived a couple doors down from me, and I just knocked on his door one day and I was like, how many rapes do you think really happened in St. Louis? And he gave it a lot of thought and kind of like an analysis to it. And he came back with a number that was like, at least 600, or like that, at least their number should be that high. And that led me on a path to, I found boxes of these memos that they had written that they were planning to shred, and did a series of stories about all of these cases that, didn't get counted. And so that was, I would say, the early 2000s, that was really my entree into investigative journalism, and pretty much never looked back.
Molly, how about you? And I always kind of wonder if people if this is a path that they choose, or do they kind of stumble into it? I mean, how about for you?
Yeah, definitely more stumbled into it. I mean, when I was coming out of college and getting my first job at newspapers, my first job was at the Peoria Journal-Star after graduate school. And I mean, I really got my thrills covering daily stories. I just loved it. I was eaten up with, anything, politics, crime, responding, and a lot of night, you pull a lot of night shifts as the young person on staff. And I really liked that instant feedback and the thrill of coming back to the newsroom from whatever scene you were at and, writing a story while, back in the day, an editor maybe sort of yelling or it was always a different atmosphere back then, but all good natured, but it was, high intensity, lots of people in the newsroom. Of course, now our newsrooms are a little bit more hollowed out and it's not quite the same, but I really enjoyed that and did that for a long time. Did a lot of political reporting, also a graduate like you are of the PAR program, the Public Affairs Reporting Program in Springfield, which was really heavily focused on politics. And so did a lot of state house tours where I covered daily politics and really liked that. I still don't necessarily, think of myself as just purely like an investigative reporter. And I'm, know the work of these two gentlemen I'm on this panel with. I feel like the seagull at the flamingo party. I mean, their work is just phenomenal. And I, I work at a really small newspaper by the way, the Southern Illinoisan, we're at the very bottom of Illinois. I'm not sure what our circulation is these days. Like everyone, it's sort of been going downhill, but the online readership is way up. So it's not a great barometer, but we just have a staff of about 3 people. So when you're covering stuff, there's with 3 people and covering about 15 counties, you don't really have the luxury of having a lot of time. But over time, I just looked at the fact that, investigative journalism doesn't have to mean one thing. It doesn't have to mean 3 years on a story or 1 year on a story. You can do investigative reporting stories in a day. And I think just over time, I started to sort of sharpen my knife and say, okay, I don't have to go cover the, state's attorney announcing, look at me, I've roped up all these high-level drug dealers, pounding their chest about that. You can look in and see like, well, who are we really arresting? What is really going on here? And some of those stories can be done, like I said, in a matter of a few days. They don't necessarily take all year. I feel really, really, really lucky that I got selected by ProPublica to work on a fellowship in 2018, where I did then get, months to work on stories. It was completely different change of pace and different approach to editing, lots of incremental editing. I remember one story I worked on, took about 6 months to get out the door. And so that was really new to me. But from that experience, I just, have kind of a different approach to what I look at, the way I look at stories and approach stories. And so I feel like now I'm trying to find a good mix where it's like a little bit of both. There's still lots of room for dailies. And I still think dailies are super important, getting news out to people. But there's also ways to do journalism that, ask those deeper questions.
Yep. Thanks, Molly. How about you, Tom? How did you get into investigative work?
Well, I think every journalist wants to be first and find stuff out, right? So that's kind of, everyone should have an investigative mindset. But when I was a political reporter and covering the state legislature, state government, I was always like, well, what do the documents say? And so I would FOIA and make, public records requests. And then you'd find like, okay, this news conference where the governor said that he was going to have a hiring freeze. Well, 6 months later, did anybody actually, or were the hires actually made? And then, you found that, 5,000 were, because they had these exemptions all over the place. And so it was basically, and some of them were simple as, oh, well, we need more workers. Well, that's the whole point, right, of hiring people. So that was one of the reasons. And then my boss at the time brought me in because it was a slow political year, because we were investigating the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis. And we got a lot of reports of sexual abuse, but Minnesota at the time was looked at as they did things the right way in the 90s because they covered this. Well, we found out that they actually covered up they were covering up the cover up. And so I came in and my boss said, well, you're pretty good with money, so why don't you investigate the Catholic Church's finances? And that was like one of those moments where I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna get fired. Like, they don't have any finances. But I started calling people and I found an accountant who ended up going to jail. And we got documents that kind of outline things. And I remember I went to prison because he let me come to interview him. And I showed up and I had the accounting documents. And I said, can you just explain this to me? A simple question, because I didn't know all this stuff. And he looks at it and he goes, okay, accounting code 1516, those were for the priests who abused kids. And accounting code 1517, those were for the ones who stole stuff and abused adults.
So let me ask you, did you react in that moment, or did you keep
I was like, well, I was flabbergasted at first, and then I was like, wait, what? And I remember the press person in the Department of Corrections who was in the prison with me, he was just like, oh my God, because he kept saying, you only have 10 minutes, you only have 10 minutes. And then he was just as fascinated. So I had like an hour interview with the guy. But after that, you have the taste of blood in your mouth at that point. And then it was kind of like, okay, we have impact when you can do this work, not to minimize the daily journalism, but give us a couple weeks to do something, or a couple months, we can really have a lot of impact in terms of how we can contribute to society. And so that was it was like, there was no looking back. So
and that leads, Jeremy, I wanted to ask you kind of like when you go into a story, do you have a certain goal in mind? I mean, beyond just sort of uncovering something, how do you make a decision of, I'm going to pursue this story versus another story?
Yeah, and it's pretty simple. It's if I find it interesting or not. I think I get easily bored, and I don't. If the story just doesn't, strike me as something, even in the best case scenario, as something that I'd sit down and read, I'll probably walk away and look for something different to work on. And that, I really want to always be telling people something they don't know, or something that they may think they know, but they don't understand it, the way that I can explain it to them, because I have the understanding based on my reporting. If I can't do that, then I probably won't do the story.
Right. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about building relationships with sources. Molly, how do you approach it? Especially, I'm thinking about all the stories you did on public housing, and not necessarily the easiest thing to get a resident to open up and talk with you about something, their lives and how housing that's not been kept up is affecting them. How did you approach finding residents who would talk?
Yeah, it's such an interesting conversation about how you build sources, and not all, like you're saying, there's all kinds of different sources, right? There's the public officials that are used to dealing with the media that we all call up, and they can be their own challenge to interview because they can speak in such a canned way, but they are at least accustomed to that. I think in the journalism I like doing best really is like talking to people who are not necessarily accustomed to being in the spotlight, right? They're where policy meets reality. The people, just regular people like us, the people out living their lives who are affected by whatever is going on around them, or whatever you're looking into. And so with the public housing situation, and it was a sensitive topic because just, most of the time when I was going to these public housing buildings, like the conditions were not the fault of the people living in them. But I mean, if you think about it, that is still your home, even if you're renting it, even if it's public housing. This is your home. Wherever you are is your home. And so to be faced with questions about conditions, you have to make sure that people understand that, like, you're not attacking them or because it wasn't about their cleanliness. It wasn't about anything that they could have done. I mean, just like in any apartment building, some families are, quote, cleaner than others. If you come in my house some days, it's not the cleanest, but that wasn't the issue. But that was a, a really sensitive topic to people, and completely understandable as to why. And so for me, it was just like showing up a lot. I find 100% of the time the best interviews come from showing up. And some people slam the door in your face and, don't want to talk to you. But most of the time I would find, even if somebody didn't want to talk about something, they weren't offended or rude about it. They just maybe didn't want to be in the spotlight. So I just made sure people understood what the story was about and how they would be portrayed. When I, would work with a source, I would interview lots and lots and lots of people. At the end of the day, only a handful of those people would be reflected in a story, because oftentimes the sources were repetitive in what they're telling you. And so those sources who are going to finally be in the pages of the newspaper or with ProPublica online, I worked with them throughout the whole process, because you may be working on a story for 6 months or so, and you can't just interview somebody in January and then they like forget about you and see their picture in the paper in July. I think that could be really shocking, especially again talking about someone's home. So I just really kept in touch with people, made sure they understood where we were in the process, got them involved. If they were claiming, hey, I made such and such complaints, I would ask them, can you get me these records, and just kind of really made sure they felt like they had, we maintain editorial control, but that they weren't like out of control in how the story would portray them as well, that they always knew and were aware. And even before a story would run, I would generally go over with them, like, generally, here's how this story, here's how you're quoted, here's what, we're going to fact check, is this still accurate? So that there were, I just felt very strongly that there should be no surprises in a situation like that.
Right. Tom, talking about anonymous sources, how do you navigate conversations with your sources about whether, that something will be off the record or on background? on the record, and maybe we should even define that for the people watching this. And also, do you have rules, in your shop about how many on the record sources you have versus off the record?
So off the record, from our point of view, and we always tell like sources this, and I guess I should back up and say, like, people who are used to dealing with the media, they understand all this stuff. Off the record means you can't share this in our shop. You can't share this with anybody except your editor. On background means that you're a source, but you're not named. That's kind of an anonymous thing. And then obviously your name is attached to this. But when you start to go out and talk to people who don't understand the media, you have to be really careful and talk to them about why this matters. I mean, you don't do this to protect me. You do it to protect your sources. And so you really have to have that conversation with them before you start to talk with them. But I think from when we navigate this, like if it's somebody who's going to be anonymous, we want at least one or two other sources or some kind of document to back that up. I very rarely go off the record with people, just because I got frustrated with it covering government, because so many people would be like, off the record this and off the record that, and it would be like, I can't write anything today if this is what you're dealing with. And so, I'd always say I want to go on background. We can talk about it. I may try to come back to you if I need to confirm something. And so if somebody would give me a tip, then I'd go work the phones or work these interviews, and then come back and be like, can we use you to confirm this? So that would be a way that you could get that journalism cycle going. But it's difficult, and I think it's even more frustrating now because there's so many people who they self-proclaim themselves to be journalists because they have a Facebook Live video or those types of things, and they don't adhere to the same kind of standards that we would be doing. And so sometimes if they get burnt in that world, then they're less likely to talk to us. So it's a careful thing, and you have to explain to people why it matters.
Right. Jeremy, do you have strategies for gathering initial background information without raising people's antenna that you're working on a specific thing, or are you pretty straightforward about it most of the time? Like, look, this is the story I'm doing, and this is the information I'm seeking.
Depends on the story. Yeah, I do, especially when you're kind of in the sniff portion of your investigation. You don't want anyone to know what you're looking at, and so you might not necessarily go directly to the center because things will change. Especially now, I've learned, working for ProPublica, that a name carries a lot of weight, and people are going to be very concerned about how they're going to be presented in a national publication. But of course, at the Post-Dispatch, it was the same. But sometimes, sometimes the best thing is to be direct and just go, somebody who has the information knows it best, and sometimes it makes sense to go directly to them. I think, the biggest factor is whether or not, if you go to, at the beginning, if you ask a very direct question, if everything's going to change because of that, if everything's going to be covered up, if that source is going to get to other sources that could have been helpful but now won't be, that can be really damaging to your investigation. So, I think it just depends on the circumstances.
I'm going to take a question here. We've got a question asking, saying, I'd love to hear panelists share an example of an investigative project they were involved with personally or watched with fascination, admiration that started with a particularly unsexy piece of information. And I'm going to leave that open. I don't know, Jeremy, if you've got something, Molly, anything come to mind, Tom?
Yeah, I'll throw one out there. I spent the better part of 2 years just going down the rabbit hole of asbestos removal and hazardous waste removal at old shopping malls and in old buildings to learn about how some brownfield tax credits were being awarded in Missouri, and ended up doing, over 2 or 3 years, I did a number of stories about just toxic waste handling, and basically what Missouri had for a long time was kind of a no-bid process for a lot of the brownfield tax credits that were being awarded. One company was basically getting all of the jobs and kind of setting their own price, and so I had to unpack how that happened. And I would say that was pretty unsexy. But
I think you raised your hand there that you had something.
Well, I covered a lot of when former President Trump talked a lot about infrastructure. I spent a lot of time on infrastructure because we thought that was the one thing that potentially could happen. And so we spent a lot of time on that. And I remember like going through SEC documents to look at Elaine Chao's her holdings and what she held. And we ended up finding that she was on the board of some, materials company that was, every time that the president or Elaine Chao talked about an infrastructure bill, the stock of the company went up at least 5 or 10%. And so we made this little graphic and we followed it, and they were talking about it. And the head of the company was actually mentioning that an infrastructure bill is going to bring us billions. But it was such a dry subject, but I couldn't believe how much reaction that story got, because it was just on infrastructure, but it was basically about politics and when the bill could potentially come up. And that was how it was like, okay, infrastructure is not very sexy, but the fact that there's so much money behind it, essentially $1 trillion, made it such a big, important issue. And, the folks who are making these decisions could be getting rich off of it.
Wow. Well, speaking of sort of those unsexy things, data, gathering all this information when you're doing investigative reporting, you've got tons of documents, hours and hours of transcripts. How do you stay organized? Molly, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, well, I was hoping I might learn a thing or two on this one. No, it's a great, obviously a very important question. It's a learning process for me. I find that when I first started doing some bigger projects, like especially on the housing situation in Carroll, which is where our original HUD project started, I had so many documents piled up on my desk. Like, I actually just cleaned my desk because the Southern is moving, and I was like, wow, there is so much here. There were boxes, some of them I didn't even open. I don't know, it was a disaster. I have learned a few things since then. I do think there is a strategy to how you organize data and just even files and everything you're getting. And maybe some of it's just common sense for those who are just more inclined to be organized. It's harder for those of us, I think, who are like a little more organic in nature about how we approach life. But Google Drive is an amazing thing. Folders, or however you want to organize your folders. Taking the time, just if you're doing a long investigative project, again, you may not publish for months, and so you interview people. If you're not careful, you can interview people and just not even remember who you've talked to or what you've talked about. So I have now, Excel files or Google Sheets where I've got, entries of everyone I've spoken to, their phone number, their contact, generally what we've talked about. If I've transcribed the tape or have transcribed, I'll include a link to the transcription of the notes, even if it's like a background conversation, so I can go back and say, okay, I remember what this person and I talked about. It is something you really have to keep on top of, or it will absolutely snowball your project, or at least prolong it. Because I've had situations where I'm like, okay, I need this quote that I know I interviewed this person 4 months ago. I know they said this thing and I have no idea who said it or where the quote is. So I can find it, but it's going to take me, 6 hours of digging through notebooks to get there. There's definitely a better way.
I have actual nightmares of that situation where I can't find my notebook or my file on the computer, and then I wake up in the middle of the night. So I completely understand that. I think it's also like I make a timeline, even like simple things, and then I add my interview subjects into that timeline and everything else when I talk to them. And I think that really helps, because if you put it in a spreadsheet, then you can put links to the documents or to everything else to say, okay, I know where this is, to prevent those kind of nightmares.
How about you, Jeremy? Has it evolved much over the years?
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask you about that timeline. That sounds like a great idea. That has always been something that I have struggled with. For years, all of my notes were emails to myself. And so my Post-Dispatch email account, they only gave us whatever, a couple gigabytes. So, I'd get an email from IT saying, clear out your email. And I'd look through and it's like 70% emails to myself. It worked great because you can search Outlook for a keyword and it'll come up, so you know what and that's basically been my note-taking system for years. But I started, new job, new year. I started this year using OneNote, it actually has really helped organize, because it's basically a notebook with tabs, and then you can, with pages and then tabs on the pages, so you can, there is some organization. You can dump whole files in there. You can dump whole PDFs, links, clips. So I've got like a whole section for clips. I've got a whole section for, different topics. So it is working great. But like when, in the heat of the moment, when you get a phone call you didn't expect, or I'm writing an email to myself. And the other day, actually, I took some notes to myself. There's another ProPublica employee. Actually, he's actually the general counsel for ProPublica, and his name is Jeremy Kuttner. And so I always get his emails, and he's probably always getting mine, but I emailed Jeremy Kuttner some of my notes, and he wrote me back, and he's like, "Did you mean to send me this?" And I'm like, "No."
Oh, super secret.
Yeah.
Well, and we were talking a little bit about this before we went live, and just sort of that transition from being a daily news reporter to working on really long-term projects, and kind of what that transition is like, and also how do you kind of stay on top of, am I moving forward with this story? And Jeremy, we can start with you.
Yeah, actually, I just got a great tip from another reporter to use the reminder app. And like every day, fill your reminder app with all the things that you intend to do, just all the people you intend to call, and then just click them off if you do it. I mean, a lot of investigative reporting is making lists and checking the box after you've done it. So it's also kind of an accountability thing. Like, I'm not going to take a break until these 6 things have been done, and so that's primarily how I've been doing it the last several weeks. And the great thing about the reminder app is you can actually share it with someone else too, and so it can be like a group reminder.
How about you, Molly? How are you making? I mean, it's a pretty recent transition from you. You started the 3-year fellowship in January, and what's it like not doing a daily news story and thinking long term?
Yeah, it's definitely different, because when you do a daily news story, in a way, you've done your job that day, and it feels really good, because it's like, hey, I've done my job. I know I've done my job. My editors know I've done my job. Check in the box. It's different with an investigative story, because it is so long term, and it's easy to get yourself, it's easy to procrastinate. It's also easy to just get down rabbit holes that maybe aren't important before you've done the things you need to do. And you may have worked 10 hours, but you just got down some hazy rabbit hole on a spreadsheet that maybe at the end of the day didn't produce what you needed. And so I think whether it's on reminder app or just an old-fashioned sheet of paper, I do try to wake up every morning and write a list of things where I'm going to spend at least half the day doing these sort of, I almost call them grunt work tasks. I mean, most of what we do is kind of unsexy, I think. There's less of the movie style. Like, I have yet to get to meet someone in a dark alley with a manila envelope, which is like my goal in life. But it's really like a lot of just, moving through a process, and just, like walking through quicksand. You just got to keep going, and making yourself do the tasks that aren't as fun, especially. And so I'll try to set aside like a certain amount of time to knock a certain amount of things I don't necessarily like doing, but I know have to be done. And then if I want to get lost in a rabbit hole down a spreadsheet, just for fun, because those things are important too, you just can block out an hour for that, and then say, all right, that's enough. I'm going to get back to some concrete tasks. So,
right. Tom, I might change the question up just a little bit. I mean, how would you characterize working on an investigative piece by yourself versus working with a team? And I think at APM, you're often working with other people, right?
So I've done both. I'm working on a couple projects by myself right now, but we did a bunch of stuff on voting, and that was with 3 different entities. It was with Wisconsin Watch, it was with Reveal Center for Investigative Reporting, and with us, and then we had other public radio stations working on it. So that was harder because, like if I know my colleague Jeff, he's going to go hard at everything. He's going to get all these documents, and he's just going to handle it, and he'll let you know when he's done. And so you don't really have to like follow up with him too much. But then there's other people that you maybe don't know so much, so you have to like continuously be like, did you make that public records request, and did you bother them to ask if it's coming or not? And so that's one of the things. When you're working by yourself, you really just have to be organized. And so on some of my projects, like I regularly will do all the things that Jeremy and Molly talked about, but I also try to have like every 2 days a check-in with my editor. And it's mostly just for me to be able to like talk the story through, and then have either Catherine or Dave say, well, what about this? Or what about that? Or remember I brought up this and you forgot all about it. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot all about that. And so those are the things that kind of help when you're on your own, especially in this Zoom world right now where we're in the pandemic and everybody's in their house. That's kind of where it's like, okay, I just need to have a call with somebody to help, get this through and talk it through a little bit.
Right. All right. Well, I'm going to take another question here. This one, I think I'll go to Jeremy with. And this is from Tom. It says, it seems that uncovering some of these stories may put you in a precarious or dangerous position. Have you ever felt threatened or fearful of retribution from those whom you've exposed in a negative way? And Jeremy, I mean, some of your investigations, it ended up with the county executive in prison. I mean, have you experienced, being nervous, being threatened?
A few times, nothing overtly. There was one situation in the early 2000s when I was covering the police department. It was when they were on Clark Avenue, and I had an office in there, and I had a computer in there, and I came in to work one day, and the computer made like a sputtering noise, like a motor that had broken. And I left, came back the next day, and it was fine, and I used it. And then I came in, the next day, and it was making this noise again. And I called the Post-Dispatch IT department out, and they opened up the computer, and the hard drive was gone. And I was like, well, it made the same sound 2 days ago, but it didn't make it yesterday. And we were like, someone is taking the hard drive in and out of the computer.
Wow.
And so at that time, the Post-Dispatch had and I was in the police department, and the Post-Dispatch had a retired homicide detective working as head of security. I'm not sure he really attacked that investigation very, very well, but never got to the bottom of it. I think we actually did tell the FBI too. This was a long time ago, but so that was the first time that was like, oh, wow. And people are very interested in what I'm doing, and enough so that they're coming in the middle of the night and taking my hard drive out of my computer. So that's pretty serious. There have been other times when I received a text or something asking about my family that seemed a little out of place, and I kind of talked about it with an editor, and it was probably nothing, and nothing ever happened. So but nothing overt. Like, I don't think I've ever been really threatened. I've been chased off properties and things like that, but nothing like from someone who I thought was like plotting against me.
Another question, this one from Devin. Have any of you covered something upsetting or disturbing that didn't catch on with the public like you thought it would? If so, what are some of those examples?
Is that for me?
For any of us, I think. Okay. The worst thing an investigative reporter can have is a story that doesn't bounce at all, and you worked 6 months on it. Some of the drier stuff on pensions, even though pensions matter a lot to a lot of people because they care, like if you don't write it the right way or tell the story in the right way, sometimes those don't catch on. I think some political stories too, they get people sometimes always, I think especially lately, a lot of people think like always the worst of politicians, which isn't always necessarily the case. And so sometimes those stories where you reveal that they've done some wrongdoing, those don't have the same effect that maybe they had in the past. And I think that's just the times we live in.
Yeah. And that brings me to another question. I mean, how do you approach the writing? I mean, when you have spent months gathering data, doing interviews with people, how do you comb through that information? I'm going to go to Molly first on this. How do you go through all that information and then sit down and tell your most compelling story?
It's really hard, especially when you're coming out of a world where you're writing dailies almost exclusively, because there is sort of a pressure of the deadline, you know, and if you've done this long enough, there's a little bit of a formula to it, to writing hard news, breaking news. And so when you have so much information and you worked really, really, really hard to get that information, I think there's a tendency, at least for me, I want to put it all in there. I just want to jam it in there. Like I'm making a cake, like I'm just throwing it in there. I don't know if I got the right ingredients or not, but like, you know, everything I've collected, I somehow want people to know about. But when I first started working with ProPublica, I had some really good editors that really drilled into me this idea of like laying out a story outline, which, you know, was something maybe I had done a little bit of, but not of this, to this degree, where you really are purposefully thinking about before writing what your main points are. And that, you know, we do a lot of stories. Some of these stories are really long, and so they'll have like mini headlines, we have sub headlines within the story, and that each sub headline like really needs to introduce a new topic. You know, you just can't be repeating the same thing over and over again. You may have multiple sources, but if they're all saying the same thing, the reader is going to get bogged down and lost. So that it was really important to say, all right, here's the roadmap from how I'm going to get from point A to point B. And that even though you may have collected, you know, hundreds of interviews and all this information that you have decided is super fascinating because you've really nerded out on whatever topic you're covering, isn't necessarily how the public needs to digest it. And so trying to figure out like, how do I make, like, all of that information isn't a waste. You know, I at some point you have to accept like not everybody's going to make it in the story. You're not writing for your sources, you know, and it can't be about that. You really want to be able to tell us, like, take all the things you've learned, and those sources could be really important for what you've learned, but they may not make it in the story, and just try to figure out a way to tell it in a way that somebody can read it without, you know, going to sleep on you, I think is really, really important. It's like there's the gathering the information is its own set of skills, and certainly being able to relay that information is a whole nother important skill.
Yeah. And Tom, I'm going to go to you on this. What, you know, keeping that in mind, taking all that information and figuring out how to tell the most compelling story, how does that change from radio to what you do for web?
Well, I think for radio, it's like subject, verb, object. And you really have to focus on a narrative and a character or two. You can't, and then you kind of have, the big debate is whether you want to have a really hard lead, this is what we learned, or if you want to create it with a character and then, you know, this is the story we're going to tell of this event, which we are going to reveal. But the fun thing about my job is I can do both now. And so like I can do that character driven story on the radio, and then I can really kind of drill down on the investigative. Okay, we're going to do it with a harder lead, and we're going to plow a lot more information in there. I mean, you know this, an 8-minute story, you can't get everything in that you want to get in. And that's a lot of time on the radio, and you can't get it all in. I mean, there's times where it's just like, this isn't going to work. Even though these characters are great, when in doubt, we're going to cut them out completely. So
yeah. And Jeremy, even with print, I mean, you can't go on forever. You know, like at some point your editor says, okay, and how do you work through what's the most compelling stuff? What am I gonna start with, and what doesn't make it in?
Yeah, it's almost like watching a movie or watching like a show from week to week. It's the reporting that you do, it's kind of cumulative, and you know, we're all writing stories about how people were harmed in some way, and a story develops during your reporting that is so upsetting, that's just so that it's just that you know that is going to be, if not the lead of the story, but the main example. And I think you're always trying to keep a list. I mean, it really comes out of the notes that we're taking in the timelines, the reminder app. It all boils down to what you found, the 5 or 6 things, and it could be bullet points, or it could be the structure of the story. It could be the sections, but the things that you find are going to dictate how you structure the story. And I think you're going to look for it's not just the most shocking examples or the upsetting examples, but it's the most representative examples too, that really tell the story the best.
So I'm going to change the subject a little bit and talk about getting public records, which is sort of that's like the meat and potatoes, right, of investigative reporting. What kinds of issues, and Molly, I'll start with you. What kinds of roadblocks do you run into when you're trying to get public records? And out of curiosity, what's the least helpful response that you've gotten when you've filed a Freedom of Information Act request?
Well, I've had lots of examples of it going really well and it going like really not well. I think that there is an art to filing a public records request. It isn't a matter of necessarily just being like, I would like to know this thing. Tell me this thing. You can't, that is not how you craft a FOIA. I think that's a common misconception that people have in the public about how you get information. The best way to get exactly what you want from a government source is to understand exactly how they keep that information. And you can do that through a number of ways. You can talk to insiders at the agency if you're seeking it from a government agency, which you would be. And maybe somebody can tell you, like, here's how we go about this process. So here's the files or database you might ask for. This is what it's called. Another good source to figure out, if you're trying to, what you want, but you don't know what it's called or how to ask for it, you can look at policy manuals of, a government agency. That's another good way to read. You have to read some really dry information, but you're like, oh, okay, I see that, when they create this process, like, employee A has to fill out this form. I'm going to ask for these forms. I think there's lots of things like that you can do. It helps if you can have a good relationship with the FOIA officer. I think that, it's really important to treat FOIA officers like any other source with a ton of respect and try to get to know them. That doesn't always work. Sometimes they're not interested in helping you, but I find that a lot of government employees at that level are trying to be responsive. That it's not, if there's going to be an attempt to slow you down or not get you what you want, it isn't really probably coming from the mid-level civil servant who, in the best of circumstances, actually takes their job really seriously and believes in the concept of open records. So I think if you can have a good relationship, that's helpful. I do have, I have better luck at the state level in Illinois. We have decent FOIA laws. It's not to say they're perfect or that they always give you what you want, but they are required to respond within 5 days. I do get a response. I still have FOIA pending with the federal agency, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, that I filed 5 years ago. And occasionally I get a FOIA officer will ask me if I'm still interested in my files. I'm like, yes. There's no excuse. Like, what? Can you give me an estimate of how long it'll be? And they'll just say, we're unable to provide an estimate. We're barely backed up. And, our options are, we could take them to court. My understanding is at the federal level, that's can be one of the few ways you can get records dislodged from some of these agencies. You have to determine whether it's worth that or not. And in this particular case, since the majority of our reporting was done, and it wasn't. So
Tom, can you beat that 5 years? Do you have any requests hanging out there?
I still have transportation related infrastructure things since when Trump took office. So I don't know if that's four and change. The federal government's really hard, and it really is like you need to know what you want and ask for it and push them. And then sometimes you need to bring a lawyer in to just, sometimes even just CC them on an email or have them call. because sometimes they're just so, I mean, the Treasury Department, like with all the stuff that's happened over the last 4 years in terms of the money that's gone out the door, sometimes I've heard from other reporters that that's the only way that they can get a document pulled out, because the civil servants have so many things that they have to do that once a lawsuit's filed, the lawyer comes in and takes that file out. And then they're like, all right, this is nonsense. Just give them the document that we can get that quickly. On the state level, it's easier. It depends on the state though. I mean, we now file FOIAs in every state because we cover things nationally. And so you need to know the law and what the law says. So Minnesota, the clock starts ticking and they just have a reasonable response time. In Illinois, they say 5 days, but they can extend it. But then you can kind of figure out what the law says, because they have exemptions to say, oh, this is an unreasonable request, we're never going to be able to fulfill it. But if they don't respond by the date they will, then they're in limbo. And then you can say, wait, you didn't respond in the date you said you would. Now you have to give me all those documents. You can't use that excuse over here anymore. And so you have to catch them in those things. And that's usually gets them pretty angry at you at first. But it's just kind of almost, and it's an art of negotiation. Like I always send an email and then I call them and I say, listen, I don't want to make you work more than you have to, but I think I'm entitled to these documents. So if there's a way that we can speed this up and you can get me the documents I want, and it's not going to cause you a lot of work, let's just figure out a way to craft it or negotiate on that. And that's when you really start to negotiate and kind of trade things here and there. So.
Yeah, Jeremy, have you found that during this pandemic that state officials, especially in Missouri, have slowed the process down of getting documents and, been able to say, hey, it's the pandemic?
I actually haven't noticed that. I feel like I've gotten a lot more cooperation during the pandemic. I don't know if it's just me, but I think I'll just echo something Molly said. I mean, you have to know who the custodians of records are and build relationships with them. They don't have to be, friendships. They don't have to be, particularly strong, but it really helps them to have a conversation about what types of records there are. Sometimes you're asking for something that may or may not exist, or it may exist in some different form, and so it always it often can help to have that conversation in advance. The other thing I'll say, I'm working on a story now where the genesis of the idea started with a couple of different individuals who I know have some records, and I have had made some sort of informal requests to them for some records, and then went about making some more formal requests to a number of other people who I don't know as well. The people that I treated informally are the last people to provide the records. So the lesson learned is, like, always send the FOIA. Don't do anything informally. Send it, hold them to the law, remind them of what the law is, and be strict. Remind people what their responsibilities are, what the penalties are for non-compliance, and that's the best way that I found to get what you're entitled to.
All right, I'm going to stick with you, Jeremy. This is a question from Lynn. So she just read The President's Men, and she's saying, from relatives who experienced it, it sounds like a story that people were glued to every day. With the information abundance of today, how do you see the relationship between the public and big stories? And then she goes on to ask, would Watergate have unfolded with the same outcome if it were to happen today?
Well, that's a tough one. I'm going to mostly speak to my coverage of St. Louis County government over the last 3 years. And I really felt like I was speaking to an audience that was addicted to the latest development in the government. So I think there are some stories that you can make really interesting for people and keep them hanging on from day to day to find out what's next and what you're going to tell them next that no one else is going to. So I think you can really develop those relationships between big stories and the public. Would Watergate have unfolded this with the same outcome?
Almost, it's impossible to say, but I mean, I think it is an interesting question. A very different landscape today. It wouldn't be people waiting for the morning newspaper. That's for sure.
No, yeah, things have sped up quite a bit. You know, the news cycle is no longer the next morning's paper. It's practically the next, the next hour. So, um, and so I think, most of the media has sped up their coverage to meet that demand.
Yeah, Molly, how do you really keep in mind, engaging the audience and with a big story and trying to find something that's really going to make them care?
For me, I mean, obviously as a reporter, the bigger your audience, the better. The bigger the public that cares, the better. But I also try to keep in mind that, the importance of your story isn't necessarily engaged by the size of your audience. There are, some stories that they're of hyper interest to where you are. I'm sure, like your county stories, Jeremy, were maybe, being read by everyone in Florida, for instance. So, I think it's just really important to keep in mind that, I mean, it's not good if no one's reading it, but as long as you're, you have an audience and you have a following, you have people that are very much interested in your topic, I think that's fine. I think that means you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. I mean, not every story is going to be a national Watergate story where, the whole country is hanging on to find out what you're doing the next day. But if you're serving your readers and your audience, whatever that is for that particular story, I think you're doing just fine.
Yeah, and Tom, I'm going to change up the question. How do you know in an investigation kind of when to sort of maybe pull the plug? If you're like, I had this theory, or I thought I had something really solid here and it's not panning out. How do you navigate that when it's I'm going to keep going, or I think I got to move on?
I think the one thing we always ask is what's the least possible story and what's the best possible story. And if you're not hitting the mark on the least possible story, or you're feeling like it's not there, it's just kind of one of those moments where you're like, all right, is this worth the effort that it's going to take to do this? I mean, I usually will, like right now I have 2 stories I'm working on that I need to wrap up in the next month or so. But I'm trying to think of what am I going to do over the next 6 months and next year, where I want to ask for those documents that could take 5 months from now. And so some of those, that's the good thing to do, because at some point you're like, all right, I'm going to cut bait on this and now focus on this other story that's maybe 5 months away, because the least possible story is just not hitting, or the tip that person gave me doesn't work. And you really have to say, all right, this is a sunk cost. It's a month of work, but who's the audience and why does this matter? And then sometimes it's just, you have to just have that discussion to pull the plug. Now, sometimes an editor may have a different feeling and they continue to push, and sometimes they're right and sometimes you're right, or vice versa. But that's the kind of push and pull that you have to have.
This is the last question because we are running out of time, and I'm going to start with you, Tom. We've had this question come up a couple of times. What percentage of the time is the investigating, the reporting versus the writing? I mean, ballpark.
90-10 or 80-20, depending on the story. But the investigating and doing the interviewing and all of that, I mean, that leads to the writing, and you think about how you're going to tell the story, but it's mostly the investigation and the reporting and the document gathering. And then the remaining, 2 weeks of whatever you're working on is when you really focus on writing.
Molly, about the same?
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree. And, I had an editor that told me, if you're really struggling to write, you're really trying to overwrite it, then you probably underreported. So, if you have all the information, then you probably should be able to more easily write the story. Now, that doesn't mean, it may go through lots of drafts. There may be lots of time in rewriting and so on. But once you have all the pieces, putting it together isn't, that's just a process. But definitely gathering information is, I think, the more time-consuming part.
Sure. And Jeremy, I'm going to change it up a little. I mean, what's the editing process like? I mean, with a big investigative project, I mean, typically, are you looking at 2 drafts, 3 drafts?
Well, no, I think it starts with 1 draft. I mean, it's not like you turn in a draft and then you turn in another draft. I think it starts with 1 document. It just kind of evolves. I like to start writing as early as I can. I mean, really the writing that you're doing is in your notes. It's in your, it's how you're thinking about it in the shower, before work. That is all part of the writing process. And it's not, for me, it's not really different than the reporting process. You can't really write it until you understand it, and you can't really understand it until you've reported it. So it's really a lot more integrated than people talk about or think about it, I think. Um, but obviously very few stories that you write are going to appear in print the exact way that you wrote it. It's gonna, at least in ProPublica, I mean, I have one story that's been published, and it was a relatively quick turn. It was my first week at work, and I did a story about how the insurrections at the state capitals last year led up to the main event on January 6th. And I mean, I was used to having maybe 2 to 3 Post-Dispatch editors, maximum, edit the story. I'm sure Molly can attest that. I mean, there were probably 15 people who edited the story from ProPublica over the course of a couple of days. And it was a great, it was a great process. I mean, it's in a Google document, and you can see the changes. You can be in there at the same time, that you're talking to the editor and the editing is taking place. So I expect that my next stories will be no less vigorously reported or edited.
Wow, well, that's great. Well, thank you to all of you, Jeremy Kohler, Molly Parker, and Tom Scheck, for joining us and giving insight into your work. Thank you all for joining us for this first virtual Mini J session. Join us next Monday for Arts, Culture, Food Journalism with Ian Frobe from the Post-Dispatch and Jeremy Goodwin from St. Louis Public Radio. Thanks all, and have a good night.
Thank you.